Cool. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I know a couple of people will trickle in. As always, we do record these and we'll share these out with any folks who have registered or attend. So you'll be able to see the recording if you missed this. But I want to do a little bit of housekeeping about the seminar series before introducing David. So just some really quick introductions. For those who I haven't met, I'm Evan. I'm the CEO and founder of Dewey. As you know, you've probably seen, we're here to try to increase the amount of research data that researchers can access, mostly from these private corporations who have really interesting data sets who typically don't work with academic researchers. So I appreciate you guys joining our seminar. We run these bi-weekly. We try to find some interesting research being done with data that's either on the platform or sometimes not even on the platform yet, but data we're trying to get on the platform, which is more in line with what Dave is going to report on today, using the Veriset data, which I'll let him get into. We have a bunch of new data sets coming. So actually this week we just added this company called Context Analytics to the product. Their social sentiment data that they feed in from Twitter. We're working on integrating a company called PredictHQ right now, which is a demand intelligence data for events. And I'm really excited about, I won't say the name yet, but some website traffic and analytics data that's coming to the platform soon. By the time we meet again in a week or two, that data should at least start to be live. But one of the top providers of website traffic and analytics data, which I think will be really great for this audience because they give us pretty much a live view of how these top domains are performing and the searches that are going into allowing people to find those domains. So yeah, stay tuned on the data vendors we're adding to the Dewey platform. It's growing really rapidly, and I'm excited to see some of the ones we have coming up. And with that, I'm going to start to introduce David. So David, thank you for joining us today. He's with the economics department at the University of Michigan. Basically, I'll just kind of turn it over to him and get straight to the meat of the presentation. I really appreciate you joining. I know we kind of scrambled to change some stuff last minute. So for those attending, I didn't do a good job this week of giving you a heads up of what the topic was. So this is going to be a fun surprise for you. In the future in events, I'm obviously going to be able to kind of give you a heads up. So you can log in and attend the events that seem most interesting to you. But with that, David, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again, and take it away.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Evan. Yeah, I'll just try to delve straight into it. So I don't think the data we use is on the platform yet, but there's a safe graph, which is based on, this is a raw data underlying safe graph, essentially. Yeah, the paper is called, it should be public. My co-authors are very anal about this. Public response to during the Russian invasion. So this is joined with Austin Wright at Chicago and Mark Polyak at Ipsos. So yeah, as I think most of us know, Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24 last year. And this invasion in particular was characterized by severe aerial bombings of civilian areas. So this is widely documented in the news. One sort of special aspect of these bombings during this particular war or this invasion was that the Ukrainian government developed a smartphone app called Air Alert that aimed to push notifications of impending air raids to civilians, and so this has helped citizens keep informed of impending threats. What we do in this paper is we combine scraped data from this app with device-level mobility data, as well as local casualty data to study the effects of this air alert system on movement and generally civilian casualties. So the main results, a small preview of them, we find a strong immediate response to these alerts, so strong that we estimate about 35 to 45% of lives have been saved due to this alert system. So compared to if there was no such alert system in place. We do find evidence of what we call alert fatigue, meaning the response of the public to these alerts declines as the war drags on. And in particular, about 8 to 15% of further casualties could have been avoided if there was a sustained response to these alerts. And then we sort of think about what policy could do to further increase the effectiveness of the system. This is obviously tricky because you cannot easily do study policy experiments in the setting. But we look at days where the government made special announcements broadcast across the nation, highlighting the risk to civilians. And on those days, we see that the response doubles compared to other days. So this suggests that targeted government messaging, in addition to the air alert system, may help to address this fatigue effect. More generally, we do also find that risk salience affect response. So civilians who are closer to the front line respond more strongly to these alerts, even though the inherent risk is the same regardless of where you are in the Ukrainian territories. So that suggests again that government messaging that manages to target this risk salience might increase, might help sustain the response over time. By the way, feel free to interrupt me with questions or post in the Q&A. I'm happy to just take questions as they go. So let's get into a little more detail. So the data we use is provided by Veriset to Ipsos Public Affairs. This is anonymized device level location data. So in particular, we observe pings. This is second by second time-stamped latitude longitude data, allowing us to observe where a device is located at a given time. The sample we use for Ukraine, after cleaning and filtering, it consists of about 500 million unique pings and 17 million unique devices. So if you look at the device penetration in Ukraine, it's about 60% of Ukrainian devices. And here we take some cleaning and filtering steps, just removing some inaccurate data. So the map in the back here shows the regions for which we do have data, specifically air alerts data. The pings data is across Ukraine. This air alerts data we scrape from a Telegram app that basically replicates the notifications from the app. It was developed by Volodymyr Agafonkin, who is also the founder of Leaflet, for the geospatial fans across among you. So he scraped it, and the app itself was developed by a software company and a security company with the support of the Ukrainian Ministry of Digital Transformation. So what the app does is it sends very loud warnings, mimicking an air alert system from the user's phone, even if the phone is in silent mode. The users can only choose to get this for one region, so that sort of obviates the concern that we might be seeing users getting alerts from regions that they are not located in. And so these are civil defense alerts. So they don't only include airstrike warnings, but also other types of warnings. We filter on those marked as airstrike warnings. The app saw widespread adoption during the war. So it was downloaded about 5 million times in the first month of the between February and September 2022. 50% of that was in the first month of the invasion. So even if you don't have the app basically doubles government security alerts. So there might be sirens blaring as well around you, not coming only from your phone. So this figure basically shows you the frequency of alerts ranked by regions that were most exposed. We have about 40 regions. And you see, in line with what you probably heard in the news, Kharkiv was, basically constantly under bombardments. And then, some other regions saw relatively few alerts. So the color here indicates the number of alerts per day. Some regions have as many as 13 alerts in one single day. There's certain regions that just had alerts active for several months on end. So then we supplement this data with local casualty data. So in particular, we use two data sources, VINA, the Violent Incident Information from News Articles database from a colleague here at the University of Michigan, and then armed location and event data from the ACLED project. So why do we combine these data? Because VINA has very accurate, very comprehensive data on events, but has no data on number of casualties, while the ACLED has very precise estimates of number of civilian casualties. So what we do is we combine these two data sets to estimate the number of casualties for every VINA event by basically correlating it with the ACLED database. And then from VINA, we also get estimates of territorial control, from which we back out the front line. So, okay, a little bit of math, but I hope it's not too overwhelming. So we estimate a simple event response study. I will show you in a figure just in one slide what it looks like. So we have a window of 30 minutes around an alert. And for each minute, we estimate basically the time trend. And then we see that's essentially what this is saying. We do this 3,000 times because we have 3,000 unique alerts. And then we get this kind of pattern. So the x-axis here gives you the minutes relative to the alert. The vertical line indicates the minute of the alert when the alert goes off. And then the y-axis gives you some measure of mobility response. So in particular, the total movement observed within the minute. Note that this doesn't necessarily mean that devices actually travel 2 kilometers, because you might see scattering around and because of the way we specifically estimate this. But what you do see is that right before the alert, there's no anticipation of what is coming, but then the minute the alert goes off, you see a very strong response. So people start basically running for cover, and this response increases in the first few minutes after the alert. So not everyone responds as strongly immediately. So that's the overall pattern. Then we break it down by period of the conflict: March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and we see that the response declines over time fairly significantly. The error bars here are not statistical confidence intervals, but just average response across all these alerts that we estimate. So we have these 3,000 alerts, and then we average and take one standard deviation above and below the average response across all the alerts. So yeah, that's the sort of main finding. So we find a strong response, but then we find a decline as the war drags on. Now the question is, what is driving this decline? It could be mechanical. It could be that civilians are just shifting to sheltering underground instead of running for cover somewhere far away, where they might be more aware of nearby shelters, and then that's why the response declines. So we find actually that that's not the case. If you look at the top figure here, there is some measure of altitude as well in the GPS data. It's not as clean basically as the measure of just location. Not every ping has an accurate altitude measurement, but we do find that similarly to the vertical response or the horizontal response, the vertical response also declines over time. So you see March, April, there's a strong, basically covering underground response. And then in later periods, this essentially disappears. So that suggests that the first explanation, maybe people are running to nearby shelters, which might be newly erected and so closer by, doesn't seem true. Alternatively, maybe people are just updating their priors on how informative the signal is. If the government is sending out alerts, but you don't observe an air raid afterwards, you might start to believe, these air alerts are nonsense. They don't actually predict the actual attacks well. To study that potential explanation, we look at the false positive rate. So we have data on actual air alerts. We have data on actual bombings. We have data on air alerts. So we can back out, how often the alerts, no bombing comes after the alerts. And then we split the response out by regions with an above median and below median false positive rate. And we see that there's essentially no difference in the response, depending on whether you have lots of false positives or not. So people don't seem to be calibrating that much with respect to the quality of the signal. So that explanation also does not seem likely. Then one that we're currently working on, which came up in a revision of the paper, is the so-called two-wall rule. So this is a sort of informal measure people have taken in Ukraine, particularly well, anecdotally, because they are tired of running for shelter every time and there's so many alerts, instead of going to an underground shelter, people will just shelter at least 2 walls away from outdoors. So this is some sort of rule of thumb for a safe shelter location in your home. So don't be next to the windows, but have at least 2 walls between you and the windows. While anecdotal evidence suggests this rule was widely adopted, and if people use this rule more, we would see lower mobility response. We again don't think it's likely that this explains the observed decline. For one, because we do see a strong correlation between lower response and increased civilian casualties. So that suggests that even if people are using this 2-wall rule, it does not appear to be effective in avoiding civilian harm. And then secondly, because anecdotally, this rule is set, people are using this rule because they are tired of sheltering. So it does seem that an increased use of the 2-wall rule suggests a decreased use of actual sheltering. And then, if you look at the Russian aerial strike capabilities, they are easily capable of destroying entire buildings, as you might have seen in news alerts. So in that sense, it doesn't seem that the 2-wall rule is a good substitute for actual sheltering. But we are working on addressing this in more detail. So ruling out all these alternative explanations, we think the observed decline in response suggests an alert fatigue effect. So people are just getting tired of sheltering as much. And I will get to one possible interpretation of what's driving this type of alert fatigue. And then, in addition, supporting the alert fatigue interpretation, we also find that higher exposure to alerts within periods leads to a lower response. So here the red is above median exposure to alerts, and we see that the response is lower if you're exposed more to alerts within a given period, as well as across periods. So it's not purely a sort of temporal effect. It seems to be really driven by just increased exposure to alerts. Okay, so with all of that behind us, are there any questions before I move on to policy implications?
I don't see any questions yet. I'm going to also post a link to the community, which would be a good place to post questions after the fact, and especially for people who might be watching this later, I can forward those questions to you as they come in, David, as well.
Great, thank you. So we'll just crack on then. So with these estimates in hand, we can ask, given the observed response, we can compare the observed response to some plausible benchmarks, and then correlate this with the observed casualties and sort of estimate how many lives were saved by the system and how many lives were lost by the alert fatigue. I would see there's one question. Oh, okay, that's just even. Okay. So in particular, again, some simple math, we estimate the avoided deaths and very similarly the excess deaths by multiplying the change in movement relative to some benchmark, which is the delta here, by the correlation between sheltering and harm, which we just estimate from correlating sheltering and harm and conditioning on some potential other explanations for sheltering for harm. And then we have this damage multiplier, which is a number of civilian casualties relative to the number of events. And so with this, we can back out sort of how many deaths were avoided by the system and how many deaths could have been avoided in the absence of the observed decrease in response. So in particular, as I mentioned, we estimated about 35 to 45% of observed casualties would have obtained in addition if there was no alert system. So this constitutes about 1,600 civilian casualties that were avoided by the alert system. And then 8 to 15% of observed casualties could have been additionally avoided with sustained response. So don't remember the exact number from our paper now, but it will be something like a few hundred additional casualties could have been avoided if there was no decline in alert fatigue. And I'm thinking particularly for people with knowledge of the ground, there was a strike in Lviv where there was a high civilian casualty rate. Again, anecdotally, because people in Lviv, far away from the front line, were not expecting we're not sheltering appropriately in response to the alerts. Okay, and then here we just plot the estimated excess deaths over time due to the alert fatigue for various ways of estimating the counterfactual, so the benchmark of sustained response. So what we're doing here is just saying, what if the response had been as high as it was in the first period, and then do our correlation exercise where we look at the correlation between civilian casualties and response, and then say, oh, this is the number of additional deaths that obtained because of the difference between the observed response at this time and the response, the average response in the first period. And so you see in the beginning of the war, there's quite high excess deaths. So in the beginning of the second period of the war, because obviously we're comparing to the first period, there's quite high excess deaths around May, June, and then there's again spikes around September, October, which is when there were significant military advances in Kherson, for example, in particular, and when the Russian army started bombing civilian infrastructure very intensely. So this, I think these timings make sense. So in light of this, we can ask, what can policy do, or maybe I should say, what can policy do more in addition to the alert system? So there's a body of evidence that suggests that message type and narrative primes can have an important effect on public behavior, particularly highlighting the social context that people find themselves in, highlighting the personal risk they face, as well as communal behavior and collective incentives can increase people's willingness to engage with public policy. So in light of this, this previous body of evidence, we sort of would want to see, ideally we want to send out, as being the government, send out not only an alert notification, but also maybe some textual notification on your smartphone that says, here are the risks of not sheltering, here are the number of casualties in recent days, highlighting personal risks and the social context. We can't do that, but what we can do is look at days where there was where the government sent out nationwide alerts based on very credible intelligence. It was broadcast across networks. I think on many of these, Zelensky himself gave an address to the nation, basically saying, the risk these days is very high. Usually it coincided with military, sort of special military events such as Veterans Day. And we see that on those days compared to the average on other days, there is the response doubles. So the response to air alert systems, to air alerts doubles, suggesting there's lots of room for policy to increase people's compliance, or people's safe behaviors, or risk avoidant behaviors. Then more generally, again, we cannot look at we cannot run an experiment here, but there's this idea that increased risk salience among people increases their response, right? So what we can do is we can look at people who are close to the front line and far away from the front line. We'd expect people close to the front line for the conflict to be more salient to them, because it's just, you're physically close, you're likely to feel more scared and more affected by these events that are only maybe a couple tens or 50 of kilometers away. And indeed, we find that devices that were 1 standard deviation further from the front line at the time of the alert respond only half as strongly. So there really does seem to be a sort of safety effect where people think, oh, I won't be affected by these strikes, but conditional on there being an alert, the risk is equally high whether you're close to the front line or not. So yeah, this really is driven by people's subjective sense of safety. Yeah, and then so that suggests, again, that similarly to the results on the nationwide broadcast, that if policy can find a way to affect people's risk salience, to highlight to them, this is the risk you're facing, they might the Ukrainian government might again be able to increase compliance with the alert system and thereby save additional lives. All right, I think that's about it for me. It's on a very long paper, so.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you for presenting. It's really cool for me to see a study on, actually such recent events too. A lot of times we're studying things that happened so far in the past, and it's cool to see that this is, things that can be implemented in policy. That's an ongoing event that's still happening today. So thank you guys for this work and for sharing it. Again, if you have any questions, I'll post one more time to the group, a link to the community. And so even for folks who might be watching this later recorded, I can send any of the questions that come through to the Dewey community to David, and then he'll reach out with a response, or at least I'll forward his response. And in terms of working with the Veriset data, I mentioned this at the very beginning, but not available on the Dewey platform yet. We are working with that team. I know them pretty well to see if there's a way to use Dewey as a distribution channel for their data into the academic side. It'll be a little different than getting on the Dewey subscription, given just kind of the sensitivity and the size of the data sets. And so it still might require, a la carte kind of permissions or payment, but still having conversations with them, because it sounds like they are interested in kind of increasing their distribution to the academic research market, which is really great to hear. So some really powerful stuff I think can be done with their data. But thank you again, David. I'll share this recording with everyone as well. And even maybe post it with a link to the working paper so they can review that. But with that, I think we'll wrap it up. I appreciate you taking your time.
All right. Thanks a lot, Evan.
All right. Talk soon. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.